How is age presented in J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls? Let's find out. How's it going, Revision Squad? It's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video I am going to discuss how the theme of age is presented in J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls. I will explain what this theme is, analyse quotations that are relevant to it, and also discuss why Priestley might have included this theme in his play. Remember that discussing an author's possible intentions could contribute to you achieving the top grades. Make sure that you have got a pen and some paper out in front of you so that you can take notes of the things that I say over the course of the video, as most of them won't be appearing on screen. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if this video helps you out, as that helps me out loads too. So when I say that this video is looking at the theme of age, what do I mean by that? So the theme of age considers how the ages of the different characters might influence their views, behaviours and decisions. It is important to keep in mind that there are two distinct age groups in this play. We have the older characters, which includes Mr. and Mrs. Burling, and the younger characters, which includes Eric and Sheila. As for Gerald, we'll talk about him in a bit. So the theme of age is as simple as that. How does age influence how characters react? Of course, your exam paper might not just say age in its question. Instead, it might ask you about age difference, a more explicit way of asking you to consider the ways in which the older generation contrasts with the younger generation and vice versa. Which means the exact same thing as the generation gap. What is the difference between the two different generations in the play? So I hope that's made it clear. This theme examines how different groups of characters behave based on their different ages. Before we look at some quotations, it's worth us thinking about Gerald for a moment. He is described as being an attractive man about 30 in the play's opening stage directions, meaning he is older than Eric and Sheila, who are in their early 20s, and younger than Mr. and Mrs. Burling, who are in their 50s. Not only is he between those two groups in terms of age, but he is between them in terms of his attitude and reactions. You see, he bears some similarities to the older generation, as he displays more capitalist tendencies and appears to be less accepting of responsibility, given that he goes out of his way to discover that Inspector Goole was a fraud. However, he does also share some qualities with the younger generation. In particular, he does show some compassion for others, since he actively rescued Eva Smith from Alderman McGarty and gave her somewhere to stay for a while. So when we're talking about age, Gerald makes our lives a little bit complicated. He is closer in age to Sheila and Eric, but his behaviour is more similar to the older generations than the younger generations. What might cause this complication? Well, I was wondering if it might be his class. Gerald is the only upper class character who appears on stage, and so perhaps this modifies and interacts with his age. It is probable that his capitalist views are more ingrained in his brain given his social class, and that this may override the tendency for compassion or more socialist thought that it seems is more prevalent in the younger generation. Now, all of this analysis and discussion has been to say that, when considering age difference, Gerald will sometimes appear on the side of the older generation and will sometimes appear on the side of the younger generation. So now it's time for some quotations. Now, because this theme is more about the differences between groups of characters, it's going to be a bit different to the rest of the theme videos in this series. And if you've not watched any of those videos, click the link that is appearing on screen about now, and you'll be taken through to my entire GCSE revision playlist for An Inspector Calls. So when considering age difference, one aspect that we could consider is how the different generations treat each other. So how do the younger generation treat the older generation, and vice versa? So at the beginning of the play, Sheila says, "Yes, go on, Mummy, you must drink our health." And only a little later on, Eric says, "Yes, you've piled it on a bit tonight, Father." So in both of these quotations, Sheila and Eric refer to their parents in a polite manner, as seen by the nouns mummy and father. Sheila's use of mummy presents her in a somewhat infantile and docile way, as if she is the perfect, compliant daughter. Eric's use of father is perhaps a little less infantile, but is still very formal and respectful. Combined then, these two quotations create the impression that the younger generation act very respectfully and properly towards the older generation, perhaps respecting the hierarchy put in place by the generation gap. Admittedly, both of these quotations do show children telling their parents what to do. Sheila wants her mother to join in with the drinking, and Eric is suggesting that his father needs to be less heavy-handed with the advice that he is giving. I think that this is within the normal boundaries of adult children and their parents. The children aren't necessarily bossing their parents around, they are just mildly challenging them. But how do the older generation treat the younger generation? Well, Mrs. Burling says, "You seem to have made a great impression on this child, Inspector." Because she refers to her daughter as this child, Mrs. Burling's dialogue implies that she does not take her daughter particularly seriously, given that children are impressionable, naive, and inexperienced. Already we get the impression then that, whereas the younger generation respect their elders, the older generation look down on them and see their opinions as insignificant. Now this idea is developed across the play and is seen particularly at the very end when Mr. Burling says, "Now look at the pair of them, the famous younger generation who know it all, and they can't even take a joke." Here, Mr. Burling is actively mocking the famous younger generation. The older generation is presented as cruel here because of the mockery, but especially because Mr. Burling is mocking his children at a time when they are likely to be emotionally stunned. By mocking his children, we see again an example of the older generation looking down on the younger generation. But this is not just an example of straightforward superiority. No. It now seems malicious and vindictive. The older generation doesn't just see the younger generation as silly, they see them as totally laughable. However, the younger generation do not necessarily always show the older generation total respect either. Late on in the play, when Eric's history with Eva has been revealed, he says, "Because you're not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble." Eric's dialogue is laden with resentment, as Eric cannot go to Mr. Burling when he's in trouble, implying that he is a poor father, and Eric knows it. This quotation, added to several others in the play, including Mr. Burling's on page 72, create the impression that the older generation are poor parents, unsympathetic and heartless. Another thing we could consider is how the different generations feel guilt, if at all. So when it comes to the younger generation and guilt, I reckon that the vast majority, an absolutely overwhelming majority, of students will make some sort of comment about Sheila. She openly asks, albeit miserably, if she is really responsible for Eva's death on page 23. That does suggest that she feels guilty. Fewer students might make a comment about how Sheila and Eric are quite forthright when it comes to admitting their involvement with Eva. Sheila asks the inspector, "You knew it was me all the time, didn't you?" on page 22, and Eric makes a similar admission on page 50. This contrasts nicely with the older generation. Mr. Burling initially denies knowing Eva Smith on page 12. Gerald tries to deceive the inspector and tell him that he doesn't know Daisy Renton on page 33, and Mrs. Burling claims to not know who Eva is when she sees her photograph on page 41. Their lies could imply a certain level of guilt, I guess. Anyway, when looking at the younger generation, which in this particular instance also includes Gerald, we can look at the emotional responses that the stage directions indicate. We have this quotation which pertains to Sheila. It says, Sheila looks at the photograph closely, recognises it with a little cry, gives a half-stifled sob, and then runs out. We also have stage directions which relate to Gerald, which say, Gerald goes out. They watch him go in silence. We hear the front door slam. Within this, you could also include the stage directions on page 42, which say, we hear the front door slam again, which indicate when Eric leaves the house. All three of these stage directions pertain to a departure. Sheila leaves when she recognises Eva and remembers what she did to her. Gerald leaves once he recounts the tale of his time with Eva. And Eric leaves. We're not totally sure why, but it is probably because he knows that he will also have to come clean about his time with her. In short, these characters leave precisely because they feel guilty for what they have done. Sheila's stage directions in particular make this explicit, given that there is a little cry and half-stifled sob, descriptive elements which make her feelings of guilt and regret apparent. The stage directions for Gerald and Eric are nice, since you could simplify them both to, we hear the front door slam, which is nice and short and hopefully easy to remember. So we can see that the younger generation feel guilty about what they did, or you could say that they regret their actions. But what about the older generation? I think that the older generation, which now only includes the senior Burlings, have a different stance with regards to guilt, which is exemplified by Mrs. Burling, who says, Unlike the other three, I did nothing I'm ashamed of or that won't bear investigation. It is apparent that she does not feel guilty about what she has done, which is made clear by the adjective ashamed, which indicates that she rejects all forms of guilt and responsibility for what has happened to Eva Smith. Here, the older generation are presented as cold, uncaring, and selfish. However, it would be inaccurate for me to say that they are completely cold, uncaring, and selfish. As the inspector begins his final speech, Mr. Burling says, Look, Inspector, I'd give thousands, yes, thousands. Right at the last minute, it seems that Mr. Burling has been struck by guilt. When he offers to give thousands, yes, thousands, he is finally offering to do something that would undo the damage that he has done by not giving Eva the comparably tiny pay rise that she asked for in the first instance. In fact, it's worth knowing that he is offering a ridiculously large sum of money for 1912, as is the extent of his guilt. However, this is far too late, both in terms of Eva's life and death, but also with regards to the evening. This could suggest that the older generation are slow to accept guilt, and so you could say that they have been presented as being dense or self-obsessed. It is also interesting to see that Mr. Burling is offering money rather than emotional support or something similar, which could imply that he views his guilt as being an economic or financial one rather than an emotional guilt. So there is our discussion of age difference and guilt. Perhaps both generations do eventually feel it, but the younger generation are certainly more ready to embrace and accept it. Something else that we might want to bear in mind when thinking about age difference is whether or not the two generations learn from Inspector Goole. Do they become kinder, more caring, and increasingly socialist? Or do they remain self-centered, greedy, and rigidly capitalist? So all of our quotations are going to come from after the inspector has left. The reason why I've chosen to do this is that I feel that the character's true feelings about him will be revealed when he has left them, including how they really feel about his lessons. So I feel that this quotation from Eric best sums up the younger generation's response to the inspector's teachings. When his family quibble about whether or not the inspector was genuine, Eric says, "Whoever that chap was, the fact remains that I did what I did, and Mother did what she did, and the rest of you did what you did to her." This quotation shows that Eric has learned from the inspector's lessons, as variations of the expression, "I did what I did," repeat across his dialogue. It is apparent that Eric has accepted that he cannot undo his actions, given that the past tense verb did has been repeated, which then also implies that he has accepted responsibility for his part in Eva's suicide. What's more is that his stance on responsibility extends not only to himself, but to the rest of his family, suggesting that he has listened to the inspector's lesson that they would have to divide the responsibility. It is clear then that Eric has certainly learned from what the inspector has said. But what about the older generation? Well, their attitude towards the inspector's teachings can be seen by Mr. Burling, who claims, "There's every excuse for what both your mother and I did. It's turned out unfortunately, that's all." This quotation shows that once the inspector has left, Mr. Burling has discarded any shred of learning that he might have gained from him, and instead reassumes the blind righteousness of capitalists. He asserts that there was every excuse for what he and his wife did, which not only tells us that he completely distances himself and his wife from responsibility, but that he also excludes the younger generation. You could argue then that the selfishness of the older generation is doubly shown in this quotation, because not only do they refuse to take any responsibility for their actions, but they also refuse to accept any responsibility for their children's actions. In short, by accepting responsibility for their actions, the younger generation prove that they have learned from the inspector's teachings. Conversely, the older generation, by distancing themselves from responsibility, show that they have not learned from Gould's visit, which is also shown by this interaction between Sheila and Mrs. Burling. Sheila claims that the inspector's true identity doesn't make any real difference, which implies that she took in his lessons not out of fear of any repercussions that she may face, but because she genuinely wants to right the wrongs that she has committed. On the other hand, Mrs. Burling claims that the inspector's true identity does make a difference, suggesting that she only cares about how the evening might affect her reputation and status. So I guess you could say that the younger generation learn from the inspector and that the older generation do not. Or could you? Here's the thing. I reckon that almost every student who studies an inspector calls will make some sort of comment about how the younger generation learn from the inspector and that the older generation does not. There's nothing wrong with this, but it's not necessarily the deepest possible analysis. You could run a bit further. You see, in his final speech, the inspector claims, "If men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish." Now that lesson that the inspector refers to is a socialist one, that we are responsible for our fellow man and must take care of him. Admittedly, it does appear that Sheila and Eric have learned this lesson by the end of the play. And yet, there was still fire and blood and anguish. Only shortly after the events of this play was the First World War, and following that the Second World War. This problematizes our analysis. Did Eric and Sheila really learn their lesson? Did they follow through on it? Or did they fall back into their self-absorbed capitalist ways? We cannot know for certain, but I certainly think that including this idea towards the end of a relevant exam question could be something deep, insightful, and analytical, and could end up being really beneficial to the grade you get. So now it is time to consider J.B. Priestley's intentions. The two different generations of characters in this play have distinct personas, and this is not something that he would have done by accident. So why is age or age difference a theme of An Inspector Calls? So first of all, I would say that he actively wanted to condemn the older generation of the 1910s and highlight their mistakes. In the 1910s, the older generation, specifically male homeowners, were very much in charge. The lack of support for the working class was their doing, as were the rights given to business owners. What's more though is that it was the older generation who would have been largely responsible for Britain engaging in the First World War, the terrors of which Priestley experienced himself firsthand. This experience, combined with his socialist political stance, would have given Priestley a pretty negative viewpoint of the generation above his, the same generation which Mr. and Mrs. Burling belonged to. By highlighting the cruelty, selfishness and poor decisions of the older generation, Priestley would have been broadcasting a message of warning to his audience. Do not follow in their footsteps. The positive presentation of the younger generation could have been Priestley's way of praising his audience, given that they would have been in the same generation as Eric and Sheila, were they real people. Praising people is one way of getting them to like you, and if people like you, they are more likely to listen to what you have to say and eventually agree with you. So by praising his audience's generation, it is likely that Priestley is trying to encourage them to agree with his play's socialist message. So that is my discussion of the theme of age in An Inspector Calls, almost done. But what could you do next? Well, if you're after some more quotations, you could think about how the different generations respond to the inspector. Are they with him or against him? Do they challenge or cooperate? Do they make the investigation easier or more difficult? Now, I'm not going to give you specific page references for this idea, although my discussion of openness and deception when talking about guilt earlier on in the video might be a useful starting place. Of course, this has been a long and quite thorough video, so I wouldn't blame you if you didn't fancy digging around for some extra quotations just yet. But before you leave, please don't forget to like the video if it's helped you out. Leave a comment on it, either letting me know how useful you found this video to be, giving me some of your own analysis, or asking me a question about this theme. And of course, if you aren't already, you could subscribe to my channel too. Now, I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are revising, please do remember to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be. So there we go. In An Inspector Calls, age is presented through the differences between the two generations. You have the older, more capitalist, less caring generation, and you have the younger, more caring, ever so slightly socialist generation too. But which one quotation do you think is most important when it comes to thinking about age in this play? Please do let me know down in the comment section below. Cheers.